Hello everyone, welcome to ASEAN Law and Policy Seminar 2. In this video lecture, we are going to look at the formation, the start, the formal establishment of ASEAN, the legal creature, with the adoption of the ASEAN Charter of 2007, right? So in the previous seminar, we looked at ASEAN, the political creature, which was 1967 to 2007. This week, we are going to look at ASEAN, the formal legal creature from 2007 onwards to today in 2021, and looking forward to the 2025 milestone. One thing to keep in mind as we go through this video is that we should bear in mind the differences between the old and the new ASEAN. Old meaning the political ASEAN, and the new ASEAN of, being a legal creature from 2007 onwards. Now, just to quickly recap what we did, the key takeaways of Seminar 1 of ASEAN, the political creature, are that we need to always bear in mind that ASEAN is, a small power. It is not really a big power. And also we are a very porous region, which is very susceptible. We are always open to the external and internal factors of change, the pressure points. ASEAN member states, the 10 member states, are very focused on security and economics as part of, our regional development, our regional cooperation, and our regional integration. There is this mindset that we are stronger together. Hence, as we cooperate and integrate more deeply, there are evolving additions to ASEAN, the regional organization, in the security and economics aspects, as we will see, right? And we will see how the development and evolution of ASEAN Way occurs. We know that some of the tenets of the ASEAN Way are non-interference, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-legalistic modes of engagement. But because as ASEAN moves into its character as a legal creature, how does this ASEAN formulation, this ASEAN Way formulation change, right? In the first seminar, we also saw that even though the first 40 years of ASEAN is really much of a political creature, but there we saw the law and institutions of ASEAN arise and grow stronger. So the important junctures are 67, the Bangkok Declaration, and then the first treaty, which is the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation of 76. And then we also have the Bali Concord I of 76. And we established the first institution of ASEAN with the Secretariat in 76. Then in the 1990s, we saw the membership of the Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and also the rise of many ASEAN economic treaties and other agreements and soft law instruments. Then came the Asian financial crisis, right, of 1997, and that culminated in 2003, the tighter regional bonds and bigger regional agenda of cooperation in Bali Concord II of 2003. And throughout the history of ASEAN, we see how apparently these law institutions, state interests, power, geopolitics, and internal and external pressures shape and move ASEAN cooperation and integration along. So we launch ourselves into 2007 when the ASEAN Charter was adopted. So I'm going to leave you this kind of cliffhanger, something to keep thinking about. Was ASEAN truly a purely political creature in 1967 to 2007, its first 40 years, or was it quasi-legal? It obviously depends on how you want to argue for it. We see that in the first 40 years, ASEAN definitely had legal instruments of a hard and soft nature. So you might want to say that ASEAN was a legal creature then, but you might also want to say that ASEAN was not very legalized, not very legal as a creature, as an international organization, because many of its hard laws were not implemented, did not come into, full play, right? So two kind of big arguments you can make. Whatever argument you want to make depends on how well you substantiate it legally. Now, looking at ASEAN, the legal creature, and we see, the adoption of the ASEAN Charter and also its 3 accompanying blueprints. So ASEAN became a legal creature in 2007 with the adoption of the Charter, and then 2008 the Charter came into force because by then all 10 ASEAN member states had ratified the Charter. So you first sign it, and then 1 year later some pass through the national parliaments to ratify. And then upon full ratification of all the member states, the Charter comes into force and is usable, right? So another big question, do you agree that ASEAN became a legal creature, in 2007 and 2008 when it came into force? Some people still argue that ASEAN is not very much legal because the laws are weak, but you can also make a very strong case, as I will do, in my own opinion, that ASEAN is a legal creature because its laws are gaining more and more force. So what do we see in the ASEAN Charter? From the accompanying reading list and the seminar sheets, we should look at the primary instrument, the primary treaty. The Charter came into force on 15th December 2008. The ASEAN community was established 7 years later at the end of 2015, right? In effect, the ASEAN Charter, upon its signing and upon coming into force, is a legally binding agreement. It is a treaty among the 10 ASEAN member states that is registered with the UN, right? And in the minds of ASEAN member states, and this is explicit on the ASEAN website, that the Charter is a firm foundation to achieve the ASEAN community, and the Charter is provides ASEAN, the organization, a legal status and also a legalized institutional framework of cooperation and integration for the ASEAN region. The other legalizing effect of the Charter is that the Charter codifies ASEAN norms, rules, and values. So you can contrast it with Article 2.1 of the Charter. And the ASEAN Charter sets clear targets for ASEAN and presents accountability and compliance. So in Seminar 1, we saw that, a lot of ASEAN laws were broken or not complied with. But the Charter is a game changer. It wants to make ASEAN member states more accountable to its commitments, not only in ASEAN treaties like the Charter and economic agreements, but also greater accountability for ASEAN soft laws, like the blueprints, like the Bali Concords, so on and so forth. So accountability and compliance, which means that states must comply with the rules innate in the treaties and instruments of ASEAN. So with the entry into force of the ASEAN Charter, it is declared that ASEAN will operate under a new legal framework and has new organs to complement and build up the community. What is then the rationale of forming, the ASEAN Charter and getting the ASEAN Community of 2015? So there is this very important document that everyone should know. It is the report of the Eminent Persons Group prior to the adoption of the ASEAN Charter. So this report of the EPG in 2007 tells us why ASEAN member states wanted to sign the ASEAN Charter and transform the organization into a legalized one. First, it sets out the rule of law and rule of institutions. It also sets out a rule that, member states must comply with their commitments to their legally binding obligations. And therefore, to make sure that ASEAN member states comply, there are now, for the first time in ASEAN, throughout all the pillars of cooperation, dispute settlement and monitoring mechanisms. There used to be, pre-2007, some dispute settlement and monitoring mechanisms, but they were not used, right? But after 2007, there are dispute settlement mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms for every area of cooperation in ASEAN. There are no dispute settlement mechanisms being used yet in ASEAN, but the monitoring mechanisms of ASEAN are kicking into action ever since 2016. And also, what is this legalized ASEAN coming into being with the ASEAN Charter of 2007? You will see in the Eminent Persons Group report and in the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN asserts legal personality. Also, part of this legal transformation is that decision-making in the economic sphere now has this ASEAN minus X formula. Okay? Decision, as we know, in the ASEAN way is consultation and consensus, so that is the primary rule. But in economic agreements, member states may choose to use the ASEAN minus X formula. Also, for the first time in the ASEAN Charter and for the ASEAN community, we have human rights and democracy being a legal obligation of the Charter. And why do we have all these, transformations, legalized transformations in the ASEAN Charter for the ASEAN community? In the Eminent Persons Group report, we find that because of the rise of China and India and also the external shocks, it is very much urgent for ASEAN to, cooperate, integrate better so that it can be more competitive in the global marketplace and also more resilient to external shocks, as we now see in the COVID-19 pandemic and also some trade wars and unilateralism in the world. It is better for ASEAN as a region to cooperate than to work against one another. And in all this, when we deal with the external world to ASEAN, there is the core idea of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work, right? So, because the region is porous, we will see how this idea, this value of ASEAN centrality works in different scenarios as the weeks go by. And of course, for ASEAN to get its charter, we want to have legal personality, we want to have stronger laws and stronger institutions to have a greater international standing and reputation in the world. In sum, as we see in the rationale, the EPG report, we are taking on adopting the ASEAN Charter for reputational, procedural, and substantive changes to ASEAN law, institutions, and policy. So how do we see, the Eminent Person Group's report being translated, being formulated in the ASEAN Charter, right? So we saw the rationale in the EPG report. So what does it mean as treaty obligation in the ASEAN Charter? We are seeing new political commitments at the top levels, meaning the ASEAN Summit, right? And also in the ministerial meetings, there are also new and enhanced commitments as we see in the preamble and Articles 1 and 2, and of course throughout the ASEAN Charter provisions. There's a new legal framework And there's legal personality, which I think is Article 3. There are new ASEAN bodies being formed and being strengthened, such as the Committee of Permanent Representatives, the ASEAN Human Rights Body. And then there are greater roles, greater competences for the ASEAN foreign ministers, which I mentioned that is a very important body of ASEAN, a very important institution of ASEAN. And because ASEAN is cooperating more, integrating more, and growing larger in powers, competences, and agenda, the Secretary General needs to have more powers, and there are also now 4 Deputy Secretary Generals to deal with the huge workload that ASEAN has. And of course, if there's a bigger workload, there will be more ASEAN meetings. And I say that, when we seek to cooperate and integrate, making everybody comply is very important. And so dispute settlement and monitoring mechanisms are a very important part of the new ASEAN, the legalized ASEAN, the ASEAN formed by the ASEAN Charter. So, enunciating the new legal ASEAN as seen in the ASEAN Charter, we need to know these legal provisions, right? The preamble and the purposes and principles, which I mentioned in the previous slide. So what do we see? It repeats things that have been built up in the previous decades of ASEAN, previous ASEAN experience, such as the ASEAN Way, and then the new input of human rights and democracy, the pledge for the rule of law, and very importantly, because ASEAN is now a legal creature, it wants this explicit treaty obligation to respect international law and various regimes. This respect for international law and its various regimes have turned up in previous ASEAN treaties, agreements, declarations, but it is reiterated in the ASEAN Charter. Yes, the legal personality is asserted in Article 3. The rights and obligations of ASEAN member states are found in Article 5. The organs are in Chapter 4, so we need to know what the institutions of ASEAN are, and we find them in Chapter 4 of the Charter from Articles 7 to 15. The decision-making bodies and powers of ASEAN in Chapter 7, Articles 20 to 21, and then the dispute settlement provisions in Chapter 8, Articles 22 to 28. These are all very, very, very important, and you need to know these provisions. So I highlight them here, and you will follow up in the reading as stipulated in your seminar sheet. Now, I want to highlight that these provisions are, statement pieces in the ASEAN Charter, and the details are enunciated in the 3 community blueprints. The preamble is here. I put it up here. You should read it for yourself. And then Chapter 1, purposes and principles, right? You see some of the principles, peace and security. We see that in the first 40 years of ASEAN, repeated for the legalized ASEAN from 2007 onwards, right? Political security, economic, sociocultural cooperation. Development is important. We need to have a single market and production base. We need trade and investment. We need democracy, good governance, the rule of law, and ASEAN centrality as ASEAN becomes the primary driving force in its interactions with the rest of the world. In Article 2, the principles, we see some repetition and also the emphasis of law, right? So ASEAN and its member states reaffirm the fundamental principles contained in the declarations, agreements, conventions, concords, treaties, and other instruments of ASEAN. We need to assure each other of the sovereignty, territorial integrity of ASEAN member states, We need to have peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference in the internal affairs of ASEAN member states as part of the ASEAN Way. Then we see the rule of law pop up, human rights and democracy also reiterated, and the emphasis of international law as well as ASEAN centrality and the repetition of, the adherence to multilateral trade rules and ASEAN rules-based regimes for economic commitments to be complied with. So these are the emphases of the Legal ASEAN. The provisions, as I elaborate, the legal personality of ASEAN in Article 3. We will examine this more closely in a later seminar. Then the membership tells us who the 10 members are and what rights and obligations these member states have. Who are the organs of power, right? So in Seminar 1, we discussed that ASEAN is not a supranational organization. It is very much intergovernmental in character. And so what does it mean? All the organs of ASEAN, act on an intergovernmental basis. So all 10 member states have an equal vote and equal say. And to move forward on an agreement, all 10 member states must agree. There is an exception in the ASEAN-X economic agreement, but that is because all member states agree that those who are ready to move ahead first can do so, right? But that's only for the economic sphere. So who are the intergovernmental organs of power? We have the ASEAN Summit of the Heads of State, of Heads of Government. We have the ASEAN Coordinating Council and the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. This is, composed of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers. We have the ASEAN Community Council, so the ministers who take care of each of the three communities, the political, security, and economic community and the socio-cultural community. Then obviously we have different ASEAN cooperation sectors, sectors like agriculture, transport sector, so on and so forth. So we have, ASEAN ministers of transport from every member states who make up these ministerial bodies. And of course, another key and very important part of the ASEAN organ of power, apart from the ASEAN foreign ministries or ASEAN foreign ministers, is the ASEAN Economic Ministerial Meeting. And then another organ is the ASEAN Secretary General, comprising, the Secretariat as well as the Deputy Secretary Generals. And then other organs are the ASEAN Senior Official Meetings. This is composed of the top senior civil servants who work on ASEAN issues and ASEAN cooperation issues. So these are usually the top officials who meet at ASEAN meetings, like the Director Generals or Permanent Secretaries of the Foreign Ministries with ASEAN portfolios. And then the ASEAN National Secretariats, based in the foreign ministries of every ASEAN member states, will support the efforts of the ASEAN organs, especially the ASEAN foreign ministers and the ASEAN senior officials. So just to recap, and coming back to our big question, our cliffhanger question, the ASEAN Charter was signed in 2007, came in force in 2008. The ASEAN community was established in 1st December 2015, and now we're 2021, right? So the question is, has ASEAN fully transformed from a political to a legal creature? Is there a change from, the first 40 years to 2021? Is there a clash between the new and old ASEAN? Maybe let's flag out some changes, okay? You may think that there is no change, while others may think there are some changes. So and the degree of change may be slight or a lot. So let's see what some of those changes are. You can make your own argument and you need to substantiate why you believe that is so. So let's look at some of the modalities. Right? The pre-charter and post-charter ASEAN. The operational modality, I think we can safely say that there is some change, quite a lot of change in my opinion, from diplomacy and informality in the first 40 years to the emphasis through the Charter on the rule of law and the rule of institutions, right? The rationale may stay very much the same even as the situation changes, right? ASEAN member states are still working on state and collective interests, political contexts. They are affected by the geopolitical environment, internal and external pressures. The principles and purposes of ASEAN, we see that from the first 40 years, many are re-emphasized in the legalized ASEAN in the ASEAN Charter of 2007. But in the Charter, there is much more emphasis on law, institutions and compliance and the rule of law. And we need to look at some of the norms. The ASEAN Way norms are repeated very much in the ASEAN Charter, but because of the input of ASEAN as a legal creature, we could say, we make a strong argument to say that, the informality, the non-legalistic, the very flexible ASEAN of 1967 to 2007 has now changed to a more emphatic approach to law and institutions with the onset of the 2007 Charter. So you can see how all this affects ASEAN and impacts on ASEAN through the ages: law, institutions, state interests, power, geopolitics, internal and external pressures. So we come back to our, final slide. I think as we look through the norms and the principles, and as you do your readings and the seminar questions, everyone should, at the end of this seminar, form an opinion, a legal opinion, and a well-substantiated legal opinion, whether you think ASEAN was purely a political creature in 1967 or 2007, or was it quasi-legal? And also, with the onset of the ASEAN Charter, we bear in mind for the future seminars whether you think ASEAN has become more and more legalized, or has this quality of legalization, strengthened and at sometimes weakened. We will explore more in the future seminars. So thank you very much and enjoy your reading.